This hour, we're having a difficult conversation. Our guest is in the hot seat already. Good morning, and Neema Grace Mutemi.
Good morning, Lou. How are you?
Very well, thank you. How are you? Karibu sana.
Asante.
You are in the hot seat this morning. And unfortunately, the issue is a hot one. So you're just going to have to go with it as it comes. Neema is the lead at Green Scorecard. And we're going to ask you, of course, what that is before we get into this topic. So what is Green Scorecard, first of all? And what does that do?
So I'm the lead of the scorecard at the Green Thinking Action Party. So the Green Thinking Action Party is one of the political parties in Kenya. We are preparing to play a role in opposition in the coming elections. Being a green party, one of the green parties in the country, we thought about getting into politics differently by driving a very deliberate agenda and focus to green issues, environmental issues, sustainability issues, and that is what we call the Green Scorecard. So the Green Scorecard isn't a program; it's bigger than a program. It's embedding everything that we do politically from a lens of how does it rank. Or if you rank it on a green scorecard. So, for instance, issues of governance, policy making, they all have a carbon footprint, a water footprint, So when you think about the ecosystem, the air, the land, and below the land, or below the seas, each of those areas of our environment need to be taken into account when we're making decisions. And I think that there's nowhere else that this becomes a very serious topic of discussion than in our food systems and food security issues.
Who decides what the appropriate variables in the scorecard are? So, and who determines the ranking, and who determines that this is what it ought to be and this is how we ought to look at it?
It's still early days, and there's precedents in other parts of the world where this has already taken foot. It's not supposed to be driven by just one party, and we're not being selfish about it, as a political party, because we also need to be ranked on that, because we believe we'll have some people in various parts of government. So it is an open conversation, starting with experts, but then also open to the members of the public to also criticize it. So when we launch it, we're going to launch it as an interactive tool.
I like what you're doing.
Yeah.
I'm merely asking that when you say you are looking at something through certain lenses,
yes,
clearly there are parameters. You're saying, something. For you to be green, you need to be this, you need to be the other, and you need to be the other. So that our listeners understand what green is all about. Because it's not just a color here.
Yeah.
No. Okay. It's environmentally friendly.
Yes.
It's this and the other.
Okay.
Yeah, that.
There are three main metrics. I think you understand your question now. The first one is what everybody sort of understands by the word green, which is environmental.
Trees.
Okay.
It starts with trees, yes.
More trees.
It starts with trees, but then it goes slightly beyond that. So environmentally sound policies and actions. The second one is governance, and the third one is dignity of households.
Okay.
Okay. So those are the three broad ones, and then the indicators now go beyond that. And we've borrowed quite a lot from what is existing, from SDGs to international principles that have been outlined by the UN and by even the Vision 2030 that have not been followed through.
Okay. You wear different hats, Neema, and to have this conversation, I think it's important to set that, because you've worn the hat working with the Food and Agriculture Organization globally. You've worn the hat of working with the Ministry of Agriculture here in the country. So obviously your mind has worked in this sector for
Her mind is green.
Indeed, for a very long time. So not surprising that you would now be part of an issue I would go ahead and say issue-based party then is going to now look for certain things, hoping that they become part of the national conversation and national psyche. How important is this issue right now as we are going towards elections, as we're going towards a new political and administration? How important then is it for us to be looking at these environmental issues, these green issues, these agricultural issues, food and security issues?
I think there's nothing more important than food. I've worked in agriculture. I started almost by mistake, but I've ended up working in the agricultural sector for more than 13, 14 years now. I started as a communication expert, and then, found my way in, reviving 4K clubs and, doing quite a lot that I had never set out to do. But I trained as an environmentalist, that's what most people don't know. My first degree is in environment. So the food conversation has got to be front and center of our politics this year. Whether we like it or not, we are a country that is a net importer of food. And that's...
Wait. We are a net importer of food.
Yes.
Most of the food, net importer. Most of the food that we consume is imported.
Yes.
Okay.
So, but let's start. This is a conversation, right? It's not an interview. So, let's start with, what do you call food in your home?
Why do you think I'm wondering so loudly? Because I'm thinking, what?
What is it that you call food? Just basically, look at the last 3 days. What do you call food in your household?
Ugali.
Number two?
So you asked me.
That's it. Okay.
No, I mean, we eat other things, surely.
What are those other things?
Main. We eat green vegetables. We eat beans, peas.
Do you call beans and green vegetables food? Yes. What is it that you call food?
The first thing he said.
The first thing I said
is ugali.
So I started off with
that is the base.
Yes, ugali. Okay. Then everything else follows. The other things the snacks like chapatis, rice, things like that.
So when you look at ugali, we are a net importer of ugali.
We are?
Yes.
Seriously?
We do not produce enough maize in this country to feed the ugali population. Okay.
So where does all this maize go? This on which we plant and we put in the cereals board warehouse and so forth.
We grow, even if we produce, we still depend on trade. We always have a deficit for maize, and that's why maize is always a headline issue.
How big a deficit?
Very, very large. I did not come prepared to answer.
Do not worry. But it's big.
The questions. But we are a net importer of maize. We are a net importer of rice. We are a net importer of wheat. Those are the three things that most Kenyans do. And let me look at Ndu for a minute, because she grew up on a different experience. Ndu, what is it, where you came from? What is it that people call food?
Well, see, this is a thing, because it depends on what part of the country that you're in. But here we are, of course. If you're in the south, you're looking at your root starches, which is your cassava, your yam, etc. If you're in the north, then you're looking at your grain starches, which is your maize, which is your wheat, your sorghum, things like that. So depending on where you are north, because of the climate, the food crop is different. And then in the south, so you're looking at root starches and then grain starches in the north. But it goes along the same line.
No. It looks similar, but it's not. Because in some of those countries we've mentioned, in the south, even our neighbors, Tanzania and Uganda, are not net importers of food. They actually grow maize for Kenyans. They do not have a high consumption of ugali like we do. But the point here is, we should be dependent on food that we can produce locally to feed ourselves, and that is a very interesting conversation to look at during the election, because we depend more on trade than production for our food.
Right.
And that changes the conversation, because now we enter into the dynamics of what is the political economy of food insecurity, and who benefits from these shortages, the perennial shortages that we have.
You're almost saying, and if I'm going to put words in your mouth, you'll forgive me later, but you're almost saying that some of the shortages that we see, there's a high possibility that those are manufactured shortages in order to benefit a few people. Before you can answer that, we saw the story that did come out yesterday. Kenyans should brace for serious food shortage following an admission by the Ministry of Agriculture that they need to raise a certain amount of money to offer subsidized farm inputs ahead of planting season, which we are quickly getting into now. right? The admission comes at a time thousands of farmers in the country's food basket are preparing to plant during these long rains seasons, but are unable to purchase inputs such as fertilizers, whose prices have rocketed. The agriculture CS yesterday said that his ministry requires 31 billion shillings to ensure inputs are brought to an affordable level, but it cannot raise the funds due to budget constraints. So Kenyans are basically being warned that there will be, number one, food shortage, there will be high prices, higher than are currently the case. And then now here, Neema is telling us that the food that is being consumed in this country, most of it comes from outside anyway. How bleak is this situation?
Well, you've put quite a lot on my desk and in my mouth. It's not as simplistic as saying it's a manufactured problem. And I get the temptation. I get why you get tempted to quickly summarize.
Why don't you succumb to the temptation? Please, just go along with us.
It's not that simplistic. It's a lot more complex than that. And it's not it's not the fault of one person or one office. This is something that has taken generations to manufacture, if we are going to use your word.
Generational fault. Okay, go on.
Because the maize we are addicted to, we have to remember, was imported. We never actually, indigenously, we cannot take ownership for maize. We cannot take ownership for rice. We cannot take ownership for chapati, which we gladly imported from the Indians when they came to build the railways. So what happened? What happened is through the process of colonization and thereafter international trade, we have abandoned what we actually consumed sustainably. And whilst colonization was not unique to Kenya, Kenyans' experience with the colonialists has been unique. Ugandans did not abandon a lot of what they eat, after being invaded by the British, and neither did Tanzanians. They don't eat more German foods than
they were not invaded. They were invaded.
There was not complete assimilation.
So there's that. There's that component, and also we are not colonized anymore. So why didn't we go back to stop looking at me? Today we're talking about food security, not.
Yes.
We're not colonized. What language are you speaking?
Well,
please go on.
So you see where we are going. So it takes a long process of unlearning certain things and remarketing. The very essence of being traditionally African, being traditionally Kenyan, which we do not do. Why don't we consume cassava? And why do you, when you find a plate of cassava on the table, why does someone's mind automatically go to, it means mom and dad are broke, or it means sasa hakuna chakula? Like,
it was food for the poor.
But since when?
Because it's affordable.
This is a genuine question.
Because it's affordable,
yes.
Then now we are saying that Kenyans are bracing for food shortage. Are they really bracing for food shortage or bracing for maize shortage?
She's asked a valid question. You know why? The conversation of shortage seems to be more conversation of urban areas. Because if I look at the rural areas, every time we've had a problem of food shortage, I don't think it's a conversation that people in the rural areas have. They have discussions around a drought or a deluge where there's too much rain, and that affects production. But in terms of day-to-day sustenance, they know how to grow their food and how to survive with what they have. So again, I think the point that has been made here is a valid one.
So in terms of then looking at how to go about this, is there then maybe an almost obscene amount of rigidity when it comes to then dealing with what then people can consume? We are saying there's a food shortage and everybody then gets their knickers in a twist because there will be no subsidies for farmers because fertilizer will be too expensive and they cannot raise the money. Whereas, are you saying that there's adequate supply of other foods that Kenyans can rely on? Yeah. So there's no food.
It needs a radical shift in thinking. The fact that you just started with shortage of food, then quickly fertilizer, you can always see how that trail goes. It's maize, fertilizer, and full stop. There's no food or there's food. And if we even go to a practical, just common knowledge, there's no crop that grows all year round through the season. And traditionally, how we did it, and the story you're referring to makes reference to Ukraine and Russia. We consumed food for very many centuries before ships were manufactured, and we started importing things from Russia and Ukraine and oil and so we have to go back to how can we, with all the technology, with all the advancements that we've made, how can we be less food secure today than we were hundreds of years ago? It doesn't make sense. It's just because we have narrowed our definition of food and we have focused on a very short list of a diet which is actually not healthy for Kenyans. We have one of the most undiversified diets in Africa. Kenyans, yes. Undiversified. And every time you just cross the border to your East African counterparts, they have, more than 20, 30 foods that they can offer you.
Give us live examples. I want to understand this diversification.
Breakfast. What do you have for breakfast
Maize
in
and
Kenya?
beans.
Githeri. Okay.
And porridge.
And porridge. Okay. That's actually good, but it goes back to maize. And the porridge is made from what? So you're eating ugali in very different forms, in the seed form, in the liquidified form, and if you have that for breakfast, then lunch you have ugali, and then you just change it with either you have it with fish or omena at lunch, and then in the evening you have it with meat. You've just eaten the same thing all day.
Yes, definitely.
That is an diverse diet. Yes,
what would a diverse diet look like?
You can eat millet, you can eat sorghum, you can eat yam, you can eat even that ugali.
And the food
you can
content
make it
is
with
different from ugali.
Banana flour, you can make.
But it's the point here that there is so much weight in terms of, if we can even call it responsibility, that's placed on the shoulders of this maize.
Yes.
Meanwhile, there are other things that can be used and consumed in the country. Who is going to be having the conversation about this radical shift that you're saying then that needs to happen?
I think it is not one person or one institution. It's across board. The media needs to play a role and first get educated to be able to cover this properly. You need to have policymakers thinking differently. You need to have politicians, as they're campaigning, thinking differently in terms of how to market. In Nigeria, they solved this. I think dealing with farmer incomes is a problem even in the developed world. But you have to look for incentives in other ways other than we will give you free fertilizer that we have imported. You need to think about, okay, if farmers don't struggle growing cassava, how can we intensify research on cassava so that we get different varieties? Cassava that is tastier, that is, infused. And in Nigeria, the minister, or the then Minister of Agriculture, who's now the president of the Africa Development Bank, passed a policy that all bread that is sold in the country has to have a percentage of cassava flour. So you're not driving away people who consumers who are addicted to wheat and have to have bread in the morning, for instance. You're not forcing them to completely change what they're used to, but you're forcing them to consume something that is more sustainable and affordable and local.
You know what you're saying? This is how I'm summarizing it, that there needs to be a push to go back to traditional foods that people ate.
Yes.
Because everything you mentioned here, growing up, my grandmother had on her farm.
Exactly.
Everything you mentioned. Yes.
And she did not call anyone to say food shortage because...
I don't recall.
Okay, so Neema, even as this story came out yesterday and then it sent people into a bit of a panic. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen? As it is, things are already so expensive. People are having to spend more shilling for filling, and then you're saying that there's going to be a shortage which would inadvertently raise the prices of things that are already considered high. How are we having this conversation in the short term? Because this thing that we're talking about, where there's going to be a shortage, is not a next year conversation. It's a tomorrow thing that we're talking about here. What needs to happen now? Or are you saying, as far as you're concerned, there really is no shortage and we just need to diversify then?
Okay. It sounds simple. Eat something else, if you can't afford bread,
Eat cake, all right.
at the expense, I think this might be used against me in future, but it's
definitely.
If you can't afford ugali, why don't you eat something else? However, even that something else, because it has been neglected for so long, might not be readily available in the volumes that we want to. So there's that. Beginning to think different and beginning to insulate ourselves for the future is an important step to take. However, in the short term, I don't think you can actually have a comprehensive solution in the short term. But you can begin to put enough pressure for that systemic thinking that and unlocking of ourselves onto ugali to change, because we have had quite a lot of conversations. There's a policy. Did you know that the government has passed a policy on flour blending? You're not supposed to be consuming ugali in raw, let me just call it maize flour.
It's raw ugali form.
Has to be blended with other, and this is
which government passed the policy?
The
government of Kenya.
Current government, I think over 4 or 3 years, has been pushing for a policy to blend and to reduce the pressure. The millers and the manufacturers.
Have you heard of this push?
Including the Unga Limiteds and all that. Them themselves, because it's the pressure that you're talking about, them themselves are pro blending the flour. But this is a conversation we need to push to consumers, because if consumers don't want to buy, flour that has been blended, you're going to have a problem pushing that product. So even though you have goodwill from government and private sector, you still have to change how Kenyans think about it, because there's a lot of stigma with some other foods, especially cassava. I mentioned cassava because I come from Ukambani, and cassava is what readily grows. It is tolerant to drought, but nobody wants to eat it, in different forms because of those traditional. I don't even think traditional is the word for it, but because of the perceptions that we've grown up with.
But it
and
is
the
traditional
attitudes.
because those are traditional foods. They were readily available. People ate them. What you're talking about is the thinking that people have grown into over time. And please.
I know I want us to take a break. It's 28 minutes to 9 o'clock, but we're having this conversation talking about coming off the back of a food shortage, possible food shortage in the country, whereas we're saying, then is it time to start changing the perspective and saying there's no food shortage? Figure that one out while we eat something else. Worthy conversation to have this morning in the studio with Neema, who is talking to us today about some of these agricultural changes, perhaps alternatives. This is Kenya's Biggest Conversation. We're taking a break on KTN Home as well. We'll be back right after taking a look at the weather and the traffic. The Kenya's Biggest Conversation continues.
This is the Situation Room.
Kenya's Biggest Conversation continues, and having this conversation about, okay, so here we are saying there's a food shortage. Here we are saying there's food insecurity. We're not producing enough net importer of food in the country, and CT is worried about that net importer.
These are very many conversations, and they're being lumped into one so that it sounds like the same thing, okay? The issue of food security, the way I understand it, this is a constant conversation, and there's a whole ministry that's supposed to look into this. And what food security means is not just we have food in the store sitting there, but we have a plan, we have a policy, we have an entire structure around which is supposed to guarantee that what we need, we have. Whether we import it, whether we grow, whatever it is. Right now, we're talking about shortages and we're talking about drought. We're talking about now more rains than we need coming along. Then suddenly Ukraine and Russia have come into the conversation. This is a different conversation. Is it that we have an absence of capacity to import the food we need? Because, as we've been told, we import it anyway.
I think the question is, why are we importing food that we could essentially grow here?
Are you aware that 2020, do you know the value of the grain that we imported into this country? 7.5 billion Kenya shillings. It's a huge business. So, and every time, unfortunately, the word shortage, every time it has come into being, You get the impression, okay, so how much do they want to import? I mean, that's a question you want to ask yourself. Because that same conversation is peppered with maize grown in the country going bad somewhere, or it was stored and wasn't stored properly, so we now have to import more. It's not a conversation that is truthful, unfortunately. So even if we are faced with a genuine problem where what we've grown may not be sufficient to fill the gap it normally does that constitute a shortage? Maybe it does. Are we able to import what we normally import? And if we can't, again, does that constitute a shortage? And then if you say shortage, okay, specifically, shortage of what exactly?
And I think you've brought up some good points. I spoke earlier and said that, you have to look at the political economy of the problem and see this is a problem for one side, but is it an opportunity for another side, and who is benefiting from it? And the conversation, it sounds very simple, but it's a very dangerous statement to tell Kenyans to do something different, because you're directly targeting pockets, and that's very, very big business, for some. So there is there is a lot of interest in keeping things exactly as they are, and I wouldn't go too much into that, but let's look at it differently. We just had the KCP results released, where the top student, is it Bruce, who scored 428. I want to ask you, what would it take in this country to get Bruce working in the food sector? Is that how we think as parents when our students score the highest marks? Would we actually attract to this thing we call the food sector, the food system?
People who didn't get what they wanted.
Exactly. And that also is another big problem, because when we're making some decisions, we already have this perception in our minds, but the people who are growing food, the farmers, are already the D student people. So us, the A students who went and studied other things, can come and make decisions overriding what these people are doing, because we do not seem to have enough trust. We need to change radically how agriculture is practiced, how it's driven, by making sure that we are attracting the right talent into it. And it is actually a misconception that agriculture is not attractive to the youth, is not attractive to people who scored A's and and good marks. I started by giving an example of myself. I never considered myself as someone who works in the agricultural industry until people like Ndu asked me, "But what do you mean you've been in this sector for 13 years? If you're not in agriculture, then who is?" So we need to shift how we look at the food industry by making sure that we're actually giving it the support that we need to give it, from the resourcing to the financing. And the financing should not always go back to subsidies and fertilizers. We cannot have a government policy for more than 20, 50 years that is just subsidizing fertilizer. That doesn't make sense.
How is agriculture practiced in this country vis-a-vis how it ought to be practiced?
Okay, the basic one is, if you decided to become a farmer today, who would you go to? You're supposed to have an extension service person that comes teaches you how to just good husbandry and how to plant, what season to plant, what seeds, where can you get it. We do not have those people employed anymore. They're now supposed to be hired by the devolved governments, the county governments, but we do not have that. We have a funny ratio like 1 to 1,000 farmers. Yet, just look at M-Pesa. How many agents do we have? So why would we have no problem getting an M-Pesa agent, but such a big problem getting extension officers? So when you look at how we distribute money and where we put money, even in that agricultural sector, where does that money go? It goes back to trade and procurement. So you can give the 31 billion, you can even multiply it and give it 61 billion. But if you're putting it in the wrong places, you continually have a shortage, because it becomes a trade conversation. And when it's trading, the money will move and it will be consumed, but it's not in agriculture. So my issue is, you have to change the human resourcing of the agricultural sector. You've got to put enough people.
Please repeat that again. that trade conversation. I'm paraphrase it, but repeat it, because in my mind it has captured what we're discussing here. Okay. So money is put into agriculture, as in the ministry, but where it actually goes.
So there are two paradigms governments align to when it comes to food security. It's either a paradigm of food sovereignty or a paradigm of food trade. Okay? I will leave you to decide which one your country takes on. So you can have food as a conversation that is, if we are invaded, we will have food. If we are Russia and everyone decides they are not trading with us today, we will still have food. That's a sovereignty thinking. And when you think food sovereignty, then you will be very wary of depending on other people, whether sources, they be private sector or other countries, deciding when and at how much you should eat. Okay? And then there's the paradigm of, well, if we don't grow enough, if we can buy it, if we can trade it, if we can give something and in return get food, that's now a trade paradigm. So the problem with the two is when you're, and there's nothing wrong with the trade paradigm, but the common assumption that you make when you're building a food system based on a trade paradigm is that you will always be in charge of externalities.
Isn't there also the assumption that when you have this trade paradigm, as you call it, that you have enough for yourself and you have some to trade with?
Not necessarily, because you could...
Or do you produce it specifically for trade?
We like to say agriculture employs 70, sometimes it can even go to 80% of this country, right? But what is that we call agriculture? It's flowers, it's French beans that we do not eat, we export. Yes. Okay? So... that is when you're saying trading, like growing fast and then exporting, all that is included. Mananasi at Del Monte and Kakuzi, all that. When we actually say agriculture, we're talking about that. Tea, coffee,
All that is agriculture.
All that is agriculture.
Though most times we think maize.
So when we put the billions into agriculture, and even there's some years, agriculture has actually been the most funded, budget. But when you actually look at it, then you need to look at it with a critical eye.
When you itemize
where did the money actually go? Because we're like, if we are incentivizing, flowers and that, then what difference does it make? And how can we be excellent? We are actually excellent in growing some crops in this country. Like we set the precedence globally, but tumeshindwa ku grow food. Does that sound like a credible argument you could actually take someone through? Why would we be the best in feeding Europe with vegetables, but then somehow we have never figured out how to sustainably feed ourselves? So those are the dangers of the trade paradigm. When we focus on food, and I think what I would go for is a blended paradigm, where we have a little bit of sovereignty to make sure that every county, every governor, if your people are eating is not coming from your county, my friend, you need to put serious systems in place to make sure that you cannot be sabotaged. If you're eating rice and there's no rice in your county, then what are you doing in terms of your food security? Because if counties decided to hoard, and just think of themselves selfishly, then what would you do? And that's the same thing we're doing. And in a sense, I think that's the only benefit we got from COVID. If I was asked, the one benefit that COVID gave us is being forced to shift how we think about survival, and being forced to shift about who we depend on for solutions, and being given an opportunity as developing countries to shift power, because we have given a lot of our power to either global traders, multinational companies, and development partners or donors, and call them by all names you want. But if they're the ones who are dictating crucial things, especially to do with your food policies, then you're in trouble. But because COVID showed us that even the countries that we look up to don't have it figured out, then we have bargaining power to say, you know what, you're not pushing me anymore towards this direction, because you people were also not...
You're floundering
You're even in worse situations, especially in food, than we are. So I'm sorry, what you're selling me is not working for you, so I'm not buying it from today. And then we look at how we can redistribute our wealth, and it's a lot of it, to our health systems, our food systems, because food is sort of at the center of everything. It's at the center of our health. It's in the center of our trade as well.
Sure. What should it look like if we're looking at a balance now, Neema, and saying what the country is able to produce, and we're talking about large scale now, that you then keep in the barns and say you're going to release and sell to the market, etc. What should it look like? What is produced here for local consumption vis-a-vis then what is imported to then complement what is produced? What should it look like? Because now you're saying net importer. How much percentage are we bringing inside? What should it be?
Okay. So first, what should it look like? We let's begin with the consumers, because they're the market, right? We are a net sick nation. Again, I'm sorry today I seem to just be focusing on the bad things, but we have
it isn't bad
a very sick.
If it's real,
if it's accurate,
if it's true, it's not
we
bad.
have a sick nation. We've got blood pressure issues, we've got diabetes, so when you actually even look at what we are feeding the nation, it's horrible, and we are going to continue to really struggle with treating a very sick nation. So we need to start with consumer research. What are Kenyans actually eating, and why, and what can we do about it? And then you treat Kenyans the way you treat sick patients. A sick patient is fed what they must eat, not what they feel like eating today. So when we start looking at it, in a very practical sense of this is what the Kenyan plate looks like, this is what the Kenyan health burden looks like, and how do we begin to introduce? We do not eat as much vegetable as we should be eating. We do not eat fruits. And when you're talking about an affordability, there are issues now of nutrition affordability. When you now break it down to oranges, mangoes, bananas, tomatoes, with things that we should actually be eating to be truly healthy, or even growing in our backyards, because we do not have to buy everything. That's a conversation we need to start from the consumer part of it. Then now you begin educating people, you begin making available what they have, and you need to stop looking at it from an urban lens constantly, because the urban population is still at the trade level. So we need to go back to the grassroots and think about our communities in the context of our cultures, in the context of what is acceptable with our religions and all that, because food is not a universal what do you call it? We are not homogeneous. There's no Kenyan diet per se. You have to go back to our traditional senses and then address the problem in that area, then design a food strategy, county by county, region by region, and then now we create a collective one in terms of how much more fish do we need. Do you know the UN releases annual reports, State of Food Security, and in 2020 we were listed as one of the unique countries where in most countries fish is very expensive and unaffordable, especially to the poor. But in Kenya we have an advantage because even the poor can afford fish in some regions. But then we have to take advantage of some of those indigenous solutions that we have towards food and incentivize them and build on them, and not finish them by just pouring money into fertilizer and NCPB.
So who's the driver of this? Or are we looking at multiple drivers of these initiatives that you've talked about? Because food not being homogeneous, number one. Number two, we're saying that shifting the conversation in terms of what ought to be consumed. Who then should drive this? Or is this a combination of factors?
County governments. Agriculture is devolved. The function that is left at the ministry is it's purely policy. But agriculture is actually a devolved function. So these are conversations that we should be holding our governors accountable. Our MCAs are the most important people to drive this conversation. This is not a parliament, senate. Yeah, there's room for them, and there's what they do with the budget, that goes to the ministry. But where that budget goes, MCAs, governors.
How would it open up? How would it change things? I keep using this example of Ireland because it just paints such a graphic picture in my mind that here was a country that went through horrible drought, horrible blight. But they said, you know what? We're going to look inside and see how we can fix this. And then became one of the largest importers of food on the globe. And the things that they did, being very singular in their approach to saying, food will not be our problem. Let us have other issues, right?
Yeah.
Let's have other issues, but let food not be an issue that you have here. So can you say that whatever shortage, whatever, be it imagined or otherwise, how then do you get to the point whereby you have sustainable sources of food and affordable food in the country?
There's no simple answer to that question. That's such a complex. If I knew that, I'd be the president of this country, right?
But
some could argue that he doesn't.
Let me rephrase the question so that I can make it easier to respond to. My understanding of how urban centers feed themselves. Yes, there's what you buy from the market, but there are many people who are actually fed by the rural constituency where they came from. Some of these vehicles you see plying our roads at night and the daytime, ferry food to the cities, to the towns every single day. Not what you found at Wakolima Market, meaning I have friends of mine in my rural, every so often there's food stuff that is sent to me. Now, the World Bank classified what we call the Juakali for a long time as the hidden economy. Meaning the structure within which they categorize businesses and how they quantify them, these businesses that we do didn't fit into it. But in the same way, when you look at the way the indices that are used by world bodies to determine hunger, shortages, and what have you in a country like ours, they don't consider the communal mechanisms that we actually have to ensure that people actually eat. Many people who live in this great city of ours, or these big towns, survive because they get food from some other place other than the town itself.
Yes.
And whereas people go to supermarkets to buy things, within many of our urban settlements, you will find places where, for instance, maize meal is milled on a smaller scale. Everything that you see happening is at a scale where they can afford it. So it is indeed a hidden economy because it isn't talked about, but it exists and is very responsible for how people survive.
It's now not so hidden. It's what we call the food system. Okay? So when you talk about food, not just as a packet of ugali and the price tag we put on it in a supermarket in Nairobi, when we talk about the food system and now start thinking about the transport system, the markets, and the roads and the water in areas. If we want to solve food today, just make sure that there's water in every single county. It's a shame how we treat our pastoralists. Those are working multimillionaires, and they work with their millions every single day. When you actually calculate the wealth they have in their livestock, but we treat them as a nuisance, as a problem to be solved. Especially now when when there's too much rain or when there's drought and there's disease, instead of thinking, how do we solve the problem of pastoralists? How do we make sure in the regions where if they're nomadic, how do we make sure that their water systems are replenished, that we stock up on hay
Neema,
as a system?
Neema, I live in this country. Do you get the impression that the people charged with the duty of ensuring that the very thing you're saying is done, do you see them taking an interest in actually solving? Because every single year when you have drought, it's the same story.
But we are always looking at the wrong place. And I say we got a good constitution. We got a very good deal with the new constitution. The problem is we don't seem to know what we actually have in our new constitution. This, if you asked me, this is something that we should be holding those governors accountable. They have nowhere to run. They're actually the ones who should solve that problem. Okay? If you are still looking at the Ministry of Agriculture, and then we will have the same narrative. Or it is the policy on subsidy, because that's the job that has been left there. Or it is, how do we buy Kenya Meat Commission? That's an end result.
But, Neema,
we're not looking at it in terms of long term.
The national government, the amphibious nature of our government is such that, on the one hand, we acknowledge that we have devolution.
Yeah.
And yet funds are still stuck at the national level.
But then solve that problem, address that problem, spotlight it, and then make sure that the funds move.
Indeed.
Do not run away from the problem and now absolve people of their responsibility because of a different problem.
I mean, look, I think we can have this conversation for for months. But obviously looking at the importance of now making relevant policy changes to say this is where the focus should be. Unfortunately, an hour runs out really quickly. We have to say thank you to you for joining us this morning. And I think thought-provoking conversations to have and moving on into the future. We're going to say goodbye to our audience on KTN Home. Don't forget the conversations continue on SpiceFM, and we come back and wrap up the conversation in a bit.